welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to be exploring something that many of us have become familiar with, and that is the science of DNA testing. After all, as we listen to television programs and radio, or perhaps we're flipping through a magazine, we notice that there's a possibility we can discover our ancestry by simply taking a swab and sending in a sample, and just for a small fee, or maybe even a large one, find out where we belong. So whether you're trying to find your ethnicity or perhaps connect with family members and areas that you weren't even familiar with, you might find that although the tests are based on sound science, that if you don't know exactly what you're doing, you can take the wrong test for the situation you're trying to explore. It's also very easy to pay too much, settle for incomplete data, or misinterpret the results. That is according to our guest joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. He is the author of the book, Finding Family, My Search for Roots and the Secrets in My DNA. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Mr. Richard Hill. Richard, thank you for being back on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Well, thank you, Daniel. I enjoyed our prior discussions, and I'm sure I will enjoy this one as well.
You bet. It's pretty exciting, when you think of the world of testing and how science has evolved, but I think sometimes maybe we place too much stock in the science part where we think, well, I'll just go ahead and pay my money and kind of leave it all up to you, but I'm going to certainly find the results I'm looking for. And certainly, as we've learned over the years, science can also be one of those arenas that proves exactly what it is you're looking for, but all of a sudden you'll find yourself fraught with some loopholes. Did you ever find that sort of a situation as you were going through the experiences that you were?
Well, there's always, surprises. And while DNA is very accurate in terms of measuring close relationships, obviously DNA paternity tests can tell you with 100% certainty whether a particular man is the father of a child. And the kinds of DNA tests that are popular today for genetic genealogy, which is the area I focus on, are very good at telling you other close relationships. You can measure relationships, aunts and uncles, brothers and sisters, half-siblings, grandparent, grandchild, first cousins, or even second cousins quite accurately. And then after that, it begins to just get iffy because of the randomness of how DNA is inherited.
I like as you read your book, Finding Family, that you were saying that as a former scientist, you understood concepts and researched the technology. But then it was also a matter of asking the right questions before and after every test. Let's go ahead and talk about what that means, because to me, I think that becomes more specific. And why I say this is true, I remember for years, as we talked about last time on the program, that I was told that apparently I had Native American blood, Cherokee specifically. And so therefore, I had the opportunity to take a DNA test. I sent in my sample, and some weeks later they came back with the results, and I was astounded to discover, okay, so I'm British, mostly, and I even had some Middle Eastern roots as well, and I thought, well, where's the Native American I was told about here, So it comes to asking the right questions, as you say, when it comes to taking the test, before and after. Let's talk about that. And I'm certain that many people have probably had their own surprises as well.
Well, first of all, you got to understand that these ethnicity reports are kind of a bonus side benefit of the tests that were primarily developed for genealogists. They're primarily developed to find genetic matches, to find other people in the database who share significant amounts of DNA with us. And if we're tracing certain branches of our family, then knowing who we match and how much DNA we share can help us confirm the paper trails, and sometimes can show us that those paper trails are wrong. And other surprises that can happen.
Now, let's talk about, for instance, what can our DNA tell us about our ethnic ancestry?
Well, the DNA that does this is a type called autosomal DNA, and that is the DNA that we get from both of our parents. We get half from our mother and half from our father. And what this does is it obviously reflects our ancestry out many generations, because our parents got their DNA from their grandparents, who got it from your great-grandparents, and so on. And scientists had discovered through other types of research that people that live in different parts of the world often will have noticeably different DNA. So what these tests started doing is, first of all, they look at a lot of our DNA, and these tests look at least 500,000 different locations. And then what they do is they compare our DNA to that of a number of reference samples. And these reference samples have been, some of them were developed from science studies of various groups and so on. And others, as this has gotten to be a bigger deal, many of these companies have actually engaged in original research, testing more and more people. Typically what a lot of them will do is go into a specific country, region, and look for people who have been in that particular area their whole lives, whose 2 parents and 4 grandparents all lived in that same area. So that appears to be kind of a stable set of DNA markers without any recent outside influence. And they test a number of people in that area, and then they look and see, and then, okay, here's most of them seem to line up in a particular pattern. There may be some outliers, and those they'll just kind of toss aside because they don't fit what most of them are. And there may be some unknown reason for that. If somebody from outside the area was into their family. So anyway, that's how they do it. And as a result, what we get from these reports is a breakdown of our ethnicity into percentages, and this is usually by different geographic regions. And there will be some certain populations that show up that aren't necessarily geographic, and that would be like the original Native Americans, and then also certain groups like Ashkenazi Jews, because that particular group is very what they call endogamous, in that they tend to marry within their close group, and as a result, there's not a lot of variation in the DNA.
Now, why is it that some ethnicities are a little more different to distinguish than others?
Well, humans have always migrated. We've always been on the move. This is for thousands of years, and they've been, our ancestors were mingling with each other and migrating from one place to another. And a lot of people, when they take a test, they think, well, I'm going to get the ethnicity of my grandparents who came from these countries. Well, national borders have really only existed, for the last couple hundred years. And yet those regions have seen migration going back for 1,000 years or more. There's some obvious examples of this, and these are regions that can be the more challenging ones to distinguish. A great example is trying to tell Scandinavian from the British Isles. And that's because of the Vikings. Most people know that the Vikings sailed, all over Europe, particularly around the British Isles, and this was like 1,000 years ago. And first of all, they raided lots of settlements, and like other sailors, even today's date, the Viking men left some DNA behind on many of their stops. And then later, groups of Vikings even started settlements. They actually started whole towns in what might today be, England or Ireland or Scotland. And so we have DNA in the British Isles where people have been in the same spot maybe for 1,000 years. They think they're entirely British or Scottish, and yet they came from, most of their ancestors came from what was a Viking settlement. So you've got a lot of Scandinavian DNA mixed in certain areas. Another thing that's hard to tell apart is French versus German. Now, again, if you think about it, it's just one landmass. People have moved back and forth for thousands of years, and in the last, 100 years or so, you've had two major world wars. Lots of people were displaced. Borders have changed and flip-flopped back and forth between those two countries. So again, it's hard to totally separate French from German. They're getting better at it, but it's hard. And another one is like you mentioned, you had Middle Eastern in your report, and it's very hard sometimes to separate Italian from Middle Eastern. And I think that's because there were the city-states in Italy were great sailors, like Venice, and they sailed with and traded with the Middle East, for centuries. And so these were major trade routes and between seaports. So you've got can be a difficult problem straightening out Italian versus Middle Eastern.
As you describe this, I'm thinking how interesting it is that we have our family stories. And now you can come to see how, while the story may be mentally accurate, but you can see that scientifically, well, there's some things we didn't consider before.
Yes.
Pretty crazy stuff there. That's why I kind of appreciate, as you were talking about in your book, it was a matter of asking the right questions before the DNA tests and then what to ask afterwards. Let's kind of explore that a little bit.
Okay. Well, one thing you got to decide, if you're looking for ethnic ancestry, and that's what we're talking about right now, there are unfortunately all kinds of companies are jumping on this bandwagon now, and there's a lot of DNA tests being promoted online and elsewhere for that purpose. And obviously, like anything else, some of them are just a lot better than others. And my wife and I have I've been into this now for many years, and so I've done all of those major tests, and my wife has done at least 7 different tests. And so I have compared the ethnicity reports for her and for myself, and comparing them against our known family history. And I also, because I've been involved in this field for so long, I have known many the true experts in the genetic genealogy field, and I know that there is kind of a general consensus among which ones are the best. And I would give you 3 tests that I think are worth doing, 2 for anybody and 1 for certain people. The first one that I would recommend is 23andMe. I have found them for my family and my wife's family and for many other people I know. They are probably the most precise right now, particularly for people of European ancestry. Another one is Ancestry DNA. They do a pretty decent job overall. Where they kind of stand out is some extra things they can do. If you have a family tree on their site and you're being compared against other people who have matching DNA and family trees, they will look beyond just your DNA, and they will also look at the family trees of you and your genetic matches. And as a result, they will find some additional migration patterns, and they call those genetic communities. For example, I belong to a genetic community called Deep South Settlers, and which they show a map of, and these are people who generally started out like in Virginia, North Carolina, and then went on to Georgia, Alabama, and on west into Texas. And that's exactly the route that my direct paternal line took. And in my wife's case, she belongs to a couple of them they've identified, and one of them is early Pennsylvania settlers, and another one is early Ohio settlers. And on her mother's side, that's exactly the route that many of her ancestors took there as they came into the country, spent a long time in Pennsylvania, and then new generations moved on through Ohio and then eventually into Michigan. So those are two good tests. A third one that I think is particularly good for people of British ancestry is one called Living DNA. And why that is good is it is a British company, and they have divided Great Britain into 21 subregions. And so you not only find out, how much, British or Scottish or Welsh you might be, but you can find like different regions within England. And my wife has done that, and well, I have too, but I don't know where my British ancestry came from, but she knows where some of it came from. And her known British ancestry matches up pretty nicely with the district and the sub-region that they say was her largest percentage from England. And that company is actually now doing additional research. They're going out and testing people, and they are testing people in the Republic of Ireland and Germany now. So hopefully we'll have even better results. And that's the thing about all of these tests, these three and all the other major ones, is that this is a real new science, and they are kind of changing it. They're adapting as they go on. They get new population studies, and then they find out everyone uses a proprietary algorithm to compare our DNA to that of the various population groups. And so they tweak their algorithms, the math that they use to figure out what those comparisons mean. And so they do keep getting better, and most of them that I've used tend to update their results, maybe once a year on average. So if you test today and you're not happy with your results, wait a year or so, they'll change.
Well, that's the other thing, too, that raises a good question is if a person decides to do more than one test, will the results actually agree or will they vary?
Well, that's a very good question. That's something that confuses a lot of people because, again, each of these tests is done differently. They analyze our DNA using different equipment, and even though each one looks at 500,000 different locations, these are customized equipment that doesn't look at the same location. There are some overlap, of course, quite a bit of overlap, but there's also some differences because they're looking for different things. And as a result, that's one reason you'll get differences. Also, they use different population references. The algorithm that they use for comparing our DNA to the references is different and proprietary in each case. And also, they define their regions differently. And they use different names, and in many areas turn out are in more than one overlapping region. So what happens is that typically at the continental level, they're usually in somewhat close agreement. In other words, separating out European, African, and Asian is usually pretty close because the differences existed for many thousands of years. We all came out of Africa, but it was, a long, long time ago that some people came out of Africa, went to Europe. Some people came out of Africa, turned the other way and went to Asia, and other people stayed in Africa. So those differences are very long-term and pretty distinctive. So they all tend to pick up that. What's harder is when they try to break it into subregions. Like for most people, it's European ancestry because that's where they have concentrated the most, is trying to break out European ancestry into today's modern countries. That becomes a challenge. I mentioned the different names for the regions and the overlapping regions. My wife is 50% Croatian. Both of her father's parents immigrated from Croatia in the early 1900s. And so she should be, 50% Croatian. And all of these tests major ones that seem to do a good job, they do assign roughly half of her DNA to regions that include Croatia. But what happens is each test places her in 2 or 3 regions with different names and borders. And again, Croatia is located in what's known as the Balkan Peninsula of southern Europe, and yet they are linguistically, they have much in common with other countries in Eastern Europe. So as it turns out, here just give you those 3 tests. On 23andMe, they put most of her ancestry on her father's side into an area they call Greek and Balkan, and yet there's some more of it in an area called Eastern Europe, and then some in another one called broadly Southern Europe. And Ancestry DNA breaks her paternal ancestry into 2 groups. One is Eastern Europe and Russia, and another one they call Germanic Europe, which they define drifts all the way down to the Mediterranean Sea. And in living DNA, they divide that up into West Balkans and then Europe East. So you see all 3 of those tests are finding her Croatian ancestry, but it's all explained or classified into different regions with different names.
I see. Wow. That's pretty amazing just how complex it can actually get, when, especially if you're just kind of diving in blind, and all of a sudden you're realizing, well, how did all these twists and turns occur?
Mm-hmm. Another thing that surprises people is, first of all, they're surprised that if they take more than one test that they don't agree as much as they thought they would. Another thing is people are very surprised to see that if 2 siblings take the test, that they will get some different results. And reasons for that is that every conception is random. And they say you get 50% of your DNA from your mother, for example, but which 50% you get is a random occurrence. So, people expect that, well, I have 4 grandparents, so I should be getting 25% of my DNA from each of my 4 grandparents. And if those grandparents had 4 distinct ethnicities, you would expect you'd be 25% of one, 25% of the other, and so on. Well, what happens is that because let's say the 50% you get for your mom is random, you may get a lot more from your mom's mother and less from your mom's father, where a sibling of yours might happen to get more from mom's father and less from mom's mother. So looking at it from percentages, for example, if you look at one particular grandparent, instead of everybody getting 25%, you might have one child gets 35% from a particular grandparent, and his brother or sister may only get 15% from that grandparent. So if these grandparents had different ethnic backgrounds, it's certainly going to skew the results of what your tests are. I mean, they're all your ancestors, but the DNA that you inherited may reflect certain branches of your family a lot more than other branches.
Now, I'm curious, will results ever change over time?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I mentioned that these companies are continuing to revise them. They're doing more research. Some of them even take into effect the self-reported ancestry of their users. They may survey your users and say, where did your 4 grandparents, what countries did your 4 grandparents come from? And then they look at the people who have 4 grandparents from the same country, and they compare those to a whole bunch of other people who reported that they had 4 grandparents from that country, and then they look for patterns, and they may be able to find some patterns that say, hey, this seems to fall in line with DNA of people who have background in this particular area. So there's more research going on like that all the time.
Mm-hmm. Now, we talked on the show last time, and your story was pretty unique as far as being discovering that you were an adoptee, or perhaps you knew that. But That lends the idea that what if the results don't match someone's family tree? Like, well, this is the way we know it is, but then all of a sudden you take a DNA test and discover, well, wait a minute. It beckons to go back to that story again.
That's right. And again, so many people, when they take one of these tests, they are expecting that this ethnicity report will match their recent ancestors' countries of origin. If you had 4 grandparents that came from, Spain, Italy, England, and France, you'd expect to get like 25% each of those ethnicities. Well, what you're actually getting is something called admixture. And this reflects not just your 4 grandparents, but it reflects ancestry from every branch of your family tree going back maybe 500 years or so. And so as a result, you have hundreds of far more distant ancestors that have contributed to your DNA. And none of us, I would say, would have every branch of our family tree traced back 500 years. So there are ancestors who lived in areas that we don't know about. And also there may be ancestors who changed their ancestry, who reported something else. You can, throughout history, there have been ethnic groups that have faced, serious and sometimes dangerous discrimination. And, I'm sure you can think of examples. And some of our ancestors may have claimed a different ethnicity than what they were born with. And then the other thing is, I mentioned the randomness that was involved too, as to which of your grandparents, for example, that you might have gotten more of and less of, and so on. But because of that randomness, yes, you get your DNA reflects all 4 of your grandparents. It reflects all 8 of your great-grandparents. But when you get up to your 16 great-great-grandparents, some of them, because of this random inheritance at each generation, may simply have dropped out of your DNA. Of your 16 lines that you have there, you may only, have DNA, or significant amounts of DNA, maybe from 12 of them, and maybe 4 of them have dropped out. It's just so even though your family tree it certainly includes all those branches, your genetic tree does not include every branch. Some of them just get washed out in the mix.
So, basically, I guess, in the end for listeners, what would be things that they should consider before they begin pursuing a DNA test? Because, as you said, there are a lot of companies that are coming on board with this. Maybe some of them aren't, what we should get involved with, and then there are other just really good ones as well. But what things should we consider before testing?
Well, I think one thing, you got to have your expectations in line and realize that all of these ethnicity reports are estimates. And as I mentioned here, they are all subject to many significant limitations. This is not easy. And there are many, many complicating factors due to the randomness and people moving around for centuries and unknown ethnicities in our family tree and distant branches and so on. So one thing I always tell people is, first of all, you should never draw an important conclusion about relationships just based on the ethnicity reports alone. Like I've had some people panic because they say, well, my father was a particular nationality or always claimed to be, and now I'm not seeing very much of that nationality in my DNA, so maybe he's not my father. Well, no, never draw that kind of conclusion based on these reports alone, on the ethnicity reports, because there's just too much vagueness and randomness going on. The way I like to tell people is that the genetic matches that you get from these tests are far more useful and important, particularly for genealogists, certainly for adoptees, Certainly for like people who are donor conceived and they're trying to find their sperm donor father, those things are far more important than the ethnicity reports. And if I can use a circus analogy, to me the genetic matches are the main event, and the ethnicity reports are kind of a sideshow. They can be fun, they can be entertaining, but they're not as inherently valuable to most of us as the genetic matching is. And the other thing to keep in mind before you take any of these tests is that the genetic matches themselves may uncover family secrets. You have to be prepared for that. Like people, I grew up not knowing I was adopted, and there are lots and lots of people now taking these tests and suddenly finding out, geez, none of my matches here match my parents. Turns out they were adopted and never told that. Other people were never told they were conceived by a donor. People were, in the early days of that, were always advised, don't tell the child, you just let him assume that the husband is the father. And then you don't have to tell them about some anonymous sperm donor. But you might find that out. And so there's other things we call NPEs, or non-paternal events, or another way to describe that is not the parent expected. So some people are taking these tests and finding out, gee, I seem to match a bunch of people on my mother's side, but I don't match anyone on my father's side, or any of the names or locations. None of it seems to match up on my father's side. Well, maybe something went on there. So there are surprises, and you can kind of be thrown for a loop if you do one of these tests and you get some kind of surprise like that.
Well, in essence, the whole journey is pretty unique, and I like that you said manage your expectations, because if you're going in thinking you're going to prove one thing and you discover something else, well, you have to pay attention to the story you were told. And I certainly was someone who experienced that because of the fact, you think Native Americans, so you grow up all these years thinking, I just traced mine back in a couple of generations. I'm part of a full-blown tribe, and I actually had talked with my biological uncle just last year, and he was actually saying, well, yeah, that's true, but we also trace back to a Scottish heritage, and he went on and on about a lot of these kinds of different things. And so after my somewhat shocking result at the time, I came to be at ease with the whole thing and realized, well, that's just it. Do you really want to discover where you come from? What are your family origins? Or are you someone who's just simply trying to prove a story that you came to believe? And it certainly, is eye-opening, no doubt about that. And the journey can be very interesting as well.
Right, and you bring up a good example there, the Native American ancestry, and that's a very common story. And sometimes it seems like 9 out of 10 families have a myth of a Native American ancestor somewhere, and it became kind of a popular thing at one time. And of course, many of the stories are simply not true, but many of them are true, and yet the DNA test is not finding them. And this is a very good point to bring up, because a lot of people are interested in this. And see, what happened is that thousands of years ago, the first Native Americans migrated from Asia into North America. At that time, there was a land bridge that existed between Asia and Alaska, what's now Alaska. And that original Native American DNA is quite distinctive. And if you take a test and they say that you have Native American DNA, well, that's the DNA that they're finding. That's that very distinctive DNA. But what has happened is that for the last 500 years, Native Americans have been mixing with Europeans. And as a result, most of that original Native American DNA has been seriously diluted. And so even, your story could be true. You could have a Native American ancestor who was actually part of a recognized tribe. But what happened is that ancestor's, background somewhere along the line there was some Europeans in that, and maybe quite a few here and there at different generations. And so as a result, while they might have been culturally Native American, they only had a small amount of that original Native American DNA. Now, one of the companies, 23andMe, has actually reported some survey results on this. And well, it's not actually survey results, it's their actual testing results. And that they found that of the millions of people doing their DNA tests, that less than 3% of them found any Native American ancestry. Now, in one of my presentations, I show a U.S. map that 23andMe provided that shows the percentage of European Americans who have Native American ancestry, and it shows it by state. And if you look at and it's colored in and so on, where it's white if there's essentially none, and then it gets a darker color as the percentage goes up. And what you see right away is that percentages in most of the eastern states are at or near zero. And when you go farther west into the western states, the numbers get larger. And if you think about it, that kind of reflects the fact that the Native Americans in the eastern states, and certainly Cherokee was a big one, they have been mixing with Europeans the longest. And the ones out west, tribes like Apache and ones that are more western tribes, they haven't been mixing with European people as long. They were more isolated for a lot longer. And so as a result, people in the eastern states whose ancestors may have been Cherokee or some other eastern tribe, there's really a very small chance that you're going to find Native American ancestry, because that original distinctive Native American that came over from Asia, that DNA has just been diluted over the last 500 years to where it's just not measurable anymore.
And I'll tell you that's true. Being in Arizona, especially the Southwest, you will see a lot of Native American representation. In fact, probably the most I've seen anywhere I've ever been. And so what you're saying is completely true. Whereas you move out east or even up into the north, it almost virtually disappears.
Right.
As far as that goes. So that makes a lot of sense, actually. But it's still possible to trace it if you but you have to do your homework, obviously.
Right. And what I tell people who are looking for this or trying to prove it is don't ignore those genetic matches, because even if it doesn't show up in the ethnicity report as Native American, start contacting your genetic matches, because you may have a second or third cousin, for example, out there who is a member of a tribe, who knows exactly who the ancestor was that you share in common, and that may even have proof that ancestor was a member of a particular tribe. So don't ignore the matches. Again, they can be many times more powerful than the ethnicity reports.
So that being said, okay, would there be a DNA profile, I guess, on file in a situation like that? When you talk about, for instance, this third cousin who says, well, as a matter of fact, this person over here, I discovered direct proof as a result, so you should sort of match up as well. Does that make sense?
Well, again, if you have a significant amount of DNA in common with a person.
Okay. That's kind of what I mean, is now we're not going beyond ethnicity, and you were saying, okay, well, you might have this third cousin that has established and proved himself as a result of this particular ancestor, whatever the case is. Now, if that's true, and since we're connected, you should be able to connect with us and prove that as well. What I'm saying is piecing the puzzle together that way.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
we're talking about the same thing, yeah, because that's true whether you're Native American or any ancestry. That's one reason the matches are so valuable, is because if you contact your genetic matches, um, some of them will be genealogists. You go back 5 years and almost all of them were genealogists, but now because of the heavy advertising by some companies on the ethnic ancestry thing, you've gotten a lot of people now who are in the databases who tested for ethnic ancestry purpose and are not genealogists. So they may not know a whole lot of it, but you'll get some of your matches will be serious genealogists, and they can trace branches of their family back, a couple hundred, 300 years maybe.
Wow.
And if you talk to those people and you communicate by email, you can find out that because your grandparents were in a particular state at a particular time, they may say, oh yeah, well, that's probably connected through such and such of my family, and I know all about them, and I'll bet your ancestor was a brother to so and so. Lots of things have been figured out because of communication among the matches.
Because I did notice that was true with this particular DNA test that I had taken, is pretty soon here was someone coming along saying, I'd kind of like to connect with you by email. And so this really changes the game a little bit, as you're suggesting here, and that is, okay, why not reach out and connect with that? Because, again, it isn't, maybe proving your story can be an important motivation for some people, okay? For me, I was just curious, do I have this particular ethnicity in me? But when I got the results back, I was thinking, well, how true was the story I grew up with? It really started confusing me in many ways. Like, was my father really my father? Was there somebody else really involved that got swept under the carpet? And that's because originally my story, started when I was younger at one point, and then all of a sudden a real truth was revealed by the time I was a teenager by my mother, the same person who said, well, this is really what happened. And then by the time I was a teenager, it changed. And I'm like, okay, so you can see how now you take this course of action, and the next thing you know, you're thinking, okay, well, now how true is any of those two stories? You see? And so that being said, certainly trying to prove your story could be a good beginning motivation, perhaps, as you said earlier, but don't have crazy expectations about that happening, but become fascinated by the journey you're about to go on. Yeah. And as you suggest, because these DNA testing companies will actually, I think you actually have to give them permission. Would it be okay if matches contact you? Is that how that works?
Yes. Okay. Every one of them has different privacy settings, and most genealogists want to be contacted, want to share their data, but there may be people who test for other reasons and don't want to share data and don't want to hear from other people. So they can exclude themselves from the matching comparisons, or exclude themselves from messages, or it varies by company as to how they do it. But yeah, you're right. You have that ability. And one of the things that I think is very true is that some families have never had any real interest in genealogy. And I grew up that way, and in my adoptive family, I knew who my 4 grandparents were, but no one in all the years I grew up, I can remember, ever really discussed the great-grandparents, who would have been my grandparents' parents or families, or where they came from or anything. It was just, you knew the generations that were alive when you were born, but you really had no knowledge of or particular interest in people before that. But yet many other people get what I call bitten by the genealogy bug, and they get fascinated by the history of the family, and where did they come from, and what migration paths did they take, and so on. like in my wife's family, now that, once I got into genealogy, after I found out my biological parents, and I worked on my own lines for a while, and then I started working on my wife's lines, and she's found out that, or I found out for her, that certain branches of her mother's family came through a particular area of Pennsylvania, and we're there for about 3 generations, probably close to 100 years. That lived in this one area in Pennsylvania, and it happens that we're going out there for to meet some old friends in the fall, and so I've kind of arranged the trip, and I discovered, we're going to go by that region of Pennsylvania, so we're going to stop and spend a night and just look around and maybe go to the local library and stuff like that, and see what we can pick up on. And she's just anxious. She's not anxious to look at the records or anything like that, because she's not the genealogist in the family. I am, but she just liked to see what the country's like, that her family came through.
That also leads to the idea of with the results. What would you like to do with them? Do you want to pursue them in a deep family history dig, or do you just kind of want to get a feel for perhaps where some of your family lived and what life was like with that?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I just to share one more personal example too, because I think this could be pretty important, especially if people pursue this. And I know we talked about this the last time you were on the program, is also be aware and cautious about reaching out to people that didn't reach out to you first. And I say this is true because, again, when I visited my biological uncle last year, it was just for a few hours, and I'm sitting there and I'm talking with him, and I had talked with him some 30 years before that, visited with him and so forth, and it was actually that much time between the last time we'd talked. I had come across, or I was reached out to by a biological sister, okay? And I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. It's unique. Wow, okay, well then it didn't surprise me either because of how my father's proclivities were. But I had actually asked him about whether or not she had reached out to him. He says, yeah, but I kind of didn't, and then she also reached out to my biological father's right-hand best friend, and his attitude is if she tries to call me again, I swear to God, I'm going to, sort of a thing. So you may run into a hard wall. And I was kind of curious, although I didn't ask him that day, why at least were you kind of unwilling to at least talk with her back and, answer some questions? But that answer actually revealed itself while I was there without having to ask, and that is, well, it's a real touchy, emotional subject, but it didn't seem to bother him that I was talking to him about it. Maybe it's because we had a relationship to a small degree 30 years before that, and she came in, I think I was actually contacted right around 2004, I think, was the first time that I had heard about this, and it was from a biological half-brother that I had connected with back in the 90s. And discovering this, but knowing these people here. So I guess I bring this up to let people know, kind of step carefully when it comes to reaching out. And I know that you also talk about that, and we talked about that on the program last time, how you go about doing something like that.
Right. And, it's no surprise that the people are very different about all kinds of things. And
people are just people.
Yeah, we're just people. And examples of adoptees, searching for their birth families. And in one case, one extreme, adoptee can find a parent or a biological sibling, and they are thrilled. In fact, the parents, particularly the birth mother, may have wondered constantly and have regretted the decision to give up the child, and always wanted to know what happened to that child, and was very curious. May have even actively been searching for the child, and so you got two sides searching for each other, and they're just thrilled to find each other. And on the other hand, you might have a situation where, let's say, a woman who had a child before she was married, gave it up for adoption. She later went on to get married, have other children, and because of the mores of how she was raised, she still considers this a deep, dark secret of which she is terribly ashamed. And because of that, she's never told her husband, she's never told her children, and none of them have a clue that there's another child out there. And you're an adoptee and you're searching and you get into that family, you're going to get a whole different reception because, that's still considered, it's unknown to most of the family, and to the birth mother herself, she still considers it a shameful secret, which is one reason I always tell adoptees, if you're searching and you do get close, you need to proceed with caution and discretion. Because even say you contact that woman, she may not have told her family. And she may be willing to talk to you privately and quietly, but she may not want to see you publicly or anything else, because she still hasn't come to terms with the original situation and isn't willing to talk about it anywhere else. But yet others will actually say, okay, it's time to talk about this, and they'll go and they'll tell their husband and tell their kids, and maybe the kids are thrilled that they have an older sibling that they can suddenly meet. So there's just all kinds of ranges of human emotions and situations when you get involved like this meeting.
So in essence, what we're suggesting here for the listeners out there is, although this is all about you, it isn't completely all about you.
Right.
So to speak. Well, I just first of all, again, want to thank you for joining us here on the program, Richard. Always a fascinating discussion with this. And the book, again, for the listeners out there is Finding Family, My Search for Roots and the Secrets of My DNA. Is there a website people can find out more about your work, how they can get the book, things like that?
Yes, my website, which I actually started 11 years ago, is DNAtestingadvisor.com. DNAtestingadvisor.com is where you can find out a lot of ways that you can begin this journey, or maybe kind of soup up the journey you're already on and go the directions that you want to go. Richard, again, thank you for being on the program today. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with people? Well, again, I would like to say that our main subject today was ethnicity reports. And again, they're interesting, they're fascinating. I recommend that most people do it. But again, approach it with a little bit of a grain of salt. There will be surprises there. There will be things you don't understand. But maybe after today's discussion, people won't be so surprised when they get different results from different companies, and they won't be surprised when a brother or sister tests and gets some different results. So I think education is a good thing. Rather than going in blindly and not having any idea and thinking that everything is just absolutely gospel. In fact, you'll see a lot of people will get some small numbers. They might say, well, you're 2.5% Middle Eastern, for example. When you get down to numbers 3% or less, it could be real. There's also a chance it's just noise. Noise in the numbers and the statistics, and it doesn't mean a thing. So definitely don't get obsessed about small numbers, and don't be too surprised if the numbers are not exactly what you expected. And most importantly on that last word is manage your expectations. Yes. No doubt about that. I'll tell you that much. Well, Richard, again, thank you for being back on the Beyond 50 radio program. And again, what is the website? DNAtestingadvisor.com. Very good. Thanks again for being on the program today. All right. Thank you.
You bet.
Bye.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can also do a little DNA discovery by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. Sign up for our weekly e-newsletter to keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50, as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.